Cold open. On a freezing Friday night in January 1981, two police officers on routine patrol in Sheffield, an industrial city in the north of England, spotted a brown Rover 3500 parked in a driveway on Melbourne Avenue. There was a man inside, and beside him, a young woman. Sergeant Robert Ring and Constable Robert Hydes weren't looking for the most wanted man in Britain. They were checking number plates. And something was off. The plates on this car didn't match the vehicle. The driver gave his name calmly. Peter Sutcliffe, 34 years old. A truck driver from Bradford, a city about 50 miles to the west. He was polite, cooperative, unremarkable. But while one officer took Sutcliffe back to the station for questioning about the false plates, the other stayed behind. And something about the scene nagged at him. So Constable Hydes walked back to the driveway, and in the dark, beside an oil storage tank, he found something that Sutcliffe had quietly discarded when he'd asked permission to relieve himself. A ball-peen hammer. And a knife. The next day, officers returned to the spot where Sutcliffe had first been seen. In a nearby garden, concealed behind a bush, investigators discovered a second knife and a piece of rope. And then, slowly, then all at once, a devastating realization swept through the West Yorkshire police. They had spoken to this man before. Not once. Not twice. 9 times. Over the course of 5 years, across the largest criminal investigation in British history, involving more than 2.5 million hours of police work, over 30,000 statements, and thousands of suspects, the man they had been desperately hunting had sat across from their own detectives 9 separate times. And every single time, they let him go. His name was Peter William Sutcliffe. The press had given him another name, the Yorkshire Ripper. Between 1975 and 1980, he killed 13 women and attempted to murder at least 7 more across the towns and cities of northern England. He attacked with hammers, screwdrivers, and knives. He targeted women walking alone at night, many of them among the most vulnerable people in society. And the question that would haunt British policing for decades wasn't just, who was he? It was, why did it take so long to stop him? How did one of the most intensive manhunts ever conducted in the United Kingdom collapse under the weight of its own mistakes? How did a hoax tape from a stranger derail the investigation for over a year? And how did a society's failure to value all victims equally allow a killer to keep going, long after he should have been caught? Because to understand how Peter Sutcliffe was finally stopped on that freezing January night, we have to go back 5 years, to a playing field in Leeds, and a woman named Wilma McCann. If you're interested in global true crime told like a documentary, consider subscribing to EnterTheCrime. This is one of the most important criminal cases of the 20th century, and it changed the way an entire country investigates murder. The world and the people. To understand the Yorkshire Ripper case, you first need to understand the world in which it happened. In the mid-1970s, the north of England was a region defined by contrast. Cities like Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, and Halifax, all clustered within the county of West Yorkshire, about 200 miles north of London, had once been the beating heart of Britain's textile and manufacturing industries. Mills, factories, coal mines. These were communities built around hard physical labor. But by the time this story begins, that world was crumbling. Britain was in the grip of an economic recession. Unemployment was rising sharply, especially in the north. Factories were closing. Entire neighborhoods were hollowed out. And for many people, particularly women living on the margins, the options were painfully limited. This is important context, because among the women who would become Peter Sutcliffe's victims, several were involved in sex work, not because of choice in any comfortable sense, but because of poverty, addiction, domestic violence, and a welfare system that offered little safety net. Others were students, civil servants, building society clerks. Some were walking home from an evening out with friends. Some were simply in the wrong place at a moment of terrible chance. And the way the police, the media, and the public would respond to these women would divide them, in death, into categories of innocent and less innocent, is one of the most troubling dimensions of this entire case. But we'll get to that. First, the victims, as human beings. Wilma McCann was 28 years old and a mother of 4 children, the eldest just 7. She lived in the Scott Hall area of Leeds. Her life had not been easy. She struggled with the pressures of single parenthood, with money, with loneliness. On the night of October 29, 1975, she went out for a drink, looking for a little relief from the weight of daily survival. She never came home. Emily Jackson, 42, was married with 3 children. She and her husband ran a small roofing business that was failing. To supplement their income, Emily occasionally engaged in sex work. She was a practical woman trying to keep a family afloat during hard times. Jane MacDonald was just 16. She was not involved in sex work in any way. She was a shop assistant, a teenager enjoying a Saturday night out in Leeds with friends. Her death would later force the police and the nation to confront an uncomfortable question: had they been taking this case less seriously because of who the earlier victims were? Josephine Whitaker, 19, was a building society clerk walking home after visiting her grandparents in Halifax. She was described by everyone who knew her as kind, bright, and full of plans. Jean Jordan, 21, was a mother living in Manchester, about 60 miles from the Yorkshire heartland, who had fallen into sex work. Inside her handbag, after her death, investigators found a clue that should have ended the entire case 2 years early. It didn't. Barbara Leach was a 20-year-old university student in Bradford, walking home from a pub just 200 yards from her front door. Jacqueline Hill, also 20, was a student at Leeds University, the final victim, attacked while walking from a bus stop to her hall of residence on a busy main road. There were others: Patricia Atkinson, Irene Richardson, Helen Ritka, Vera Millward, Yvonne Pearson, Marguerite Walls, each one a person with family, with history, with a future that was stolen. And then there were the survivors. Women who were attacked and left for dead but who lived. Women like Marcella Claxton, Marilyn Moore, and others whose testimonies would provide vital clues, clues that were sometimes ignored. On screen, map of West Yorkshire showing locations of attacks. Now, the man who would be charged with all of this. Peter Sutcliffe was born on June 2, 1946, in Bingley, a small town in the Ayr Valley, in West Yorkshire. He was the eldest of 6 children in a working-class family. His father, John, was a domineering, physically imposing man. His mother, Kathleen, was described by those who knew her as warm and gentle, but trapped in a difficult marriage. As a young man, Peter Sutcliffe was quiet, almost invisible. Former schoolmates would later recall a boy who didn't stand out, not particularly clever, not particularly athletic, not particularly anything. He worked a succession of unremarkable jobs: gravedigger, factory worker, eventually a long-distance truck driver. In 1974, he married a Czech-born schoolteacher named Sonia Surma. By outward appearances, they were an ordinary couple. They lived in a modest house in Heaton, a residential area of Bradford. Neighbors described Sutcliffe as polite but shy. He kept his car clean. He went to work. He came home. But beneath this unremarkable surface, there were fractures. People close to the family would later describe a man who was deeply affected by an incident involving his mother. Kathleen Sutcliffe's extramarital affair was exposed publicly, and Peter was reportedly devastated. Some criminologists have pointed to this as a possible psychological trigger, though Sutcliffe himself would later offer a very different explanation for his actions, one involving voices from God. There were other early warning signs that only became visible in hindsight. In 1969, Sutcliffe was arrested for going equipped for theft. He was found carrying a hammer in a red light district. The incident was noted and then forgotten. And here's the detail that should unsettle you. By every metric the police used to identify their suspect, the type of car he drove, the area he lived in, the blood type determined from forensic evidence, his physical description from survivors, Peter Sutcliffe matched. Repeatedly. And still he slipped through. Something in the system was broken. Several things, in fact. But on the night of October 29, 1975, none of that had become apparent yet. On that night, all that mattered was a woman named Wilma McCann, walking along a road on the outskirts of Leeds, trying to get home. She would never arrive. And everything, for 13 families, for an entire region, and for British policing itself, was about to change. The crime. Wilma McCann's body was found on the morning of October 30, 1975, on the Prince Philip playing fields in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, a district known at the time for poverty and street-level sex work. She had suffered fatal blunt force injuries to the head, consistent with a hammer blow, along with multiple stab wounds. Her clothing was disturbed. The attack was intense, violent, and strikingly deliberate, which disturbed the detectives at the scene. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a drunken fight. The pattern of injuries suggested someone who had come prepared with weapons and who had attacked with a specific, violent intent. The investigation that followed was thorough by the standards of the day but ultimately inconclusive. There were few witnesses, limited forensic technology, and, critically, the social reality that crimes against women in Chapeltown's red light district did not always receive the same urgency as crimes elsewhere. But this was only the beginning. 3 months later, in January 1976, Emily Jackson was found in an almost identical condition, blunt force trauma to the skull, followed by multiple stab wounds, in a different part of Leeds. The same signature. The same method of approach. The same devastating outcome. Now police were certain, the same man had killed both women. And then came a gap. Nearly a full year with no murder attributed to the attacker. Investigators hoped, perhaps naively, that it had stopped. That the killer had moved, been imprisoned for another offense, or simply ceased, but he hadn't. In February 1977, Irene Richardson was found on Soldiers Field in Roundhay Park, Leeds. Then, in April, Patricia Atkinson was discovered in her own flat in Bradford, a significant shift, because this was the first time the killer had attacked indoors. And then, in June 1977, came the murder of Jane MacDonald, 16 years old. Walking home on a warm summer night. Jane MacDonald's death was a turning point, not because her life was worth more than those who came before her, but because the media and the public responded differently. Suddenly, the headlines changed. The language shifted. An innocent victim, the newspapers called her. The implication, never stated quite so baldly but unmistakable, was that the earlier victims had somehow been less innocent, less worthy of outrage, less deserving of protection. This distinction between women involved in sex work and women who were not would poison the investigation in ways that weren't fully understood until much later. It shaped which witnesses were believed, which leads were prioritized, and, ultimately, which assumptions drove the hunt. After Jane MacDonald, the attacks continued with sickening regularity. Jean Jordan, murdered in Manchester in October 1977. And here is where the case should have broken open. In Jordan's handbag, police found a brand new £5 note. In the late 1970s, British currency could be traced. The serial number on that note led investigators to a specific batch issued by the Midland Bank to a payroll distribution covering approximately 30 employers in the Shipley and Bingley areas of Bradford. One of those employers was the haulage firm where Peter Sutcliffe worked. Police began interviewing employees of those firms. Sutcliffe was among the men spoken to. And here's the critical detail. 8 days after killing Jean Jordan, Sutcliffe returned to where he had left her body, reportedly in a panic about the banknote, and further attacked the remains. This showed a level of forensic awareness. He knew the note could be traced. He tried to retrieve it but couldn't find it in the dark. Detectives now had a geographic area, a pool of suspects, and a piece of physical evidence linking the killer to a specific payroll. And Sutcliffe was interviewed. Briefly. Routinely. And released. The killing continued. Yvonne Pearson, January 1978, Bradford. Helen Ritka, just 18, January 1978, Huddersfield. Vera Millward, May 1978, Manchester. Josephine Whitaker, April 1979, Halifax. Barbara Leach, September 1979, Bradford. Marguerite Walls, August 1980. Jacqueline Hill, November 1980. 13 women. At least 7 others were attacked and survived. And across all of this, 5 years of terror, a region paralyzed by fear, women afraid to walk alone at night, community groups organizing patrols, The police investigation grew larger and larger, swallowing resources, manpower, and ultimately, its own capacity to function. Because by the time Sutcliffe was caught, the investigation had generated over 2.5 million index cards. Filing cabinets were so full that they could no longer be searched efficiently. Tips came in faster than they could be processed. The system, which was entirely paper-based, had effectively collapsed under its own weight. But the most catastrophic failure wasn't the filing system. It was something far simpler and far stranger. It was a cassette tape. And when that tape arrived at the incident room in 1979, it didn't just slow the investigation. It sent it careening in the wrong direction entirely. That's when the real nightmare began. The investigation. The investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper murders was led, in large part, by Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield of the West Yorkshire Police. A career detective, determined, experienced, and, as it would turn out, fatally susceptible to a trap he never saw coming. From the early stages, the investigation operated on a set of assumptions that would prove both useful and dangerous. The first assumption was that the killer was local, someone who lived in West Yorkshire and knew the geography intimately. This was correct. The second assumption was that the killer primarily targeted women involved in sex work, and that his motivation was rooted in a hatred of these women. This was partially correct. Many victims were involved in sex work, but it created a bias that narrowed the investigation's focus and, some would argue, reduced its urgency. When women who were clearly not involved in sex work were attacked, the police sometimes hesitated to link those cases to the Ripper, creating dangerous gaps. The third assumption, and the one that would cause the most damage, was built around a series of letters and a tape recording. Between March 1978 and June 1979, someone claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper sent 3 handwritten letters to George Oldfield and to the Daily Mirror newspaper. Then, in June 1979, a cassette tape arrived. On screen, partial transcript of the tape. On the tape, a man's voice, calm, taunting, with a distinctive accent from the northeast of England, mocked Oldfield personally. "I'm Jack," the voice said. "I see you are still having no luck catching me." The accent was unmistakable. It was not from West Yorkshire. It was from Wearside, the area around the city of Sunderland, roughly 100 miles to the northeast. Dialect experts confirmed it. The speaker was almost certainly from the Castletown area of Sunderland. George Oldfield became convinced that the tape was genuine, convinced that it was the Ripper's voice. And this conviction reshaped the entire investigation. A massive public campaign was launched. The tape was played on television, on radio, in shopping centers, at football matches. Millions of people heard it. A telephone hotline was set up. Members of the public could call a special number and listen to the recording. Over 50,000 calls came in. And critically, a new filter was applied to every suspect in the investigation. Does he have a northeastern accent? Peter Sutcliffe did not. He spoke with the flat, broad vowels of Bradford. He sounded nothing like the man on the tape. And so, despite the fact that he had already been interviewed multiple times, despite the fact that his car had been spotted in red light districts, that his boot size matched prints found at crime scenes, that he drove the type of vehicle witnesses described, and that he lived in the exact area flagged by the £5 note, Sutcliffe was effectively eliminated from the primary line of inquiry. The man on the tape was not the Yorkshire Ripper. He never had been. His name, as the world would learn 26 years later, was John Humble, an alcoholic from Sunderland with no connection to the murders whatsoever. In 2005, advanced DNA analysis matched saliva on the envelope to Humble. He was convicted of perverting the course of justice in 2006 and sentenced to 8 years in prison. But by the time the hoax was exposed, the damage was incalculable. At this point in the investigation, you might be asking yourself, how does something like this happen? How does an entire police force chase a phantom while the real killer continues to operate? The answer lies in a concept that psychologists call confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and prioritize information that supports what you already believe, while unconsciously dismissing evidence that contradicts it. George Oldfield believed the tape was real. And once he believed it, every piece of evidence was filtered through that belief. But Oldfield wasn't the only problem. The investigation was drowning in data. By 1979, the incident room in Leeds had become a paper avalanche. Over 2.5 million index cards. Over 30,000 witness statements. Thousands of suspect files. And all of it managed by hand, in card indexes, physical folders, handwritten cross-references. There was no computer database. No digital search function. No way to efficiently connect a tip received in March with a report filed in August with a statement taken in November. Leads fell through the cracks not because detectives were lazy, but because the volume of information physically exceeded the system's capacity. A detective might interview Sutcliffe about the £5 note one month, and a different detective might interview him about a car spotted in a red light district 4 months later, and neither would know about the other's conversation. The cross-referencing that might have connected those interviews simply didn't happen. Meanwhile, the survivor testimonies, women who had been attacked and lived, provided physical descriptions that repeatedly pointed to someone matching Sutcliffe's appearance. But these descriptions were sometimes considered unreliable or were not given sufficient weight. Some critics have argued that the police placed less value on the testimony of women involved in sex work. This is a contested point, and not every officer was dismissive. But the overall pattern suggests that certain voices were heard more clearly than others, and that had consequences. At this stage, consider this. If you were leading the investigation, what would you have done differently? Who would you have focused on? Sometimes the most chilling thing about a case like this isn't the killer's cunning. It's how many chances were missed. Inside the investigation, there were detectives who doubted the tape. Officers who flagged Sutcliffe as worth a closer look. Reports were written. Concerns were raised. But in the hierarchy of a large police force in the late 1970s, junior officers did not easily override senior commanders. And George Oldfield, who had staked his professional reputation on the tape's authenticity, was not a man inclined to reverse course. The investigation, in the words of one later report, had developed tunnel vision. And so the killing went on. Through 1979. Through 1980. 3 more women died, Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, and Marguerite Walls, while the police searched for a man with a Sunderland accent who didn't exist. Then, in November 1980, Jacqueline Hill was murdered. She was a 20-year-old student at the University of Leeds, attacked in the early evening near a well-lit main road. This was not a back alley. This was not a red light district. The brazenness of the attack and the escalating public fury made it clear that the investigation was failing. Pressure came from every direction. The Home Secretary, the British government minister responsible for policing, intervened. A review team was appointed. New leadership was brought in. Superintendent Dick Holland, one of the original investigators, was sidelined. And at last, the Wearside tape was treated with the skepticism it deserved. But the case wasn't broken by a new investigative strategy, or a DNA breakthrough, or a brilliant deduction. It was broken by a routine traffic stop. 2 constables. A set of false number plates. A man sitting in a car in Sheffield with a woman he intended to harm. And a hammer, hidden by a storage tank in the dark. Everything the investigation had failed to do, all the systems, all the resources, all the thousands of man-hours, was rendered moot by 2 alert police officers doing a routine check. And now, the entire case would be decided in a courtroom. But what happened there would spark a controversy all its own. Psychological breakdown. After his arrest on January 2, 1981, Peter Sutcliffe initially denied everything. For 2 days, he maintained that he was simply a man with false number plates, a minor motoring offense. Then his wife Sonia visited him. And after that visit, Sutcliffe asked to speak to detectives. What followed was a lengthy confession, detailed, specific, and chilling in its calm delivery. Sutcliffe admitted to 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. He described each attack methodically. He remembered dates, locations, and details that only the perpetrator could have known. At this point, the case diverged based on differing psychological perspectives. Sutcliffe claimed that he had been acting on instructions from God. He described hearing a divine voice emanating, he said, from a gravestone while he worked as a gravedigger in the late 1960s, commanding him to kill women involved in sex work. He said the voice was persistent, inescapable. He said he had no choice. This claim, and whether it was genuine, would become the central battle of his trial. Psychiatrists who examined Sutcliffe were divided, but several concluded that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. They believed the voices were consistent with auditory hallucinations. Based on their assessment, the prosecution initially agreed to accept a plea of guilty to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility, a legal concept in English law that means the defendant was suffering from a recognized mental condition that substantially impaired their responsibility for their actions. If accepted, it would mean Sutcliffe would be sent to a psychiatric hospital rather than a prison. But the trial judge, Justice Borum, was not satisfied. He had read the psychiatric reports, and he had questions. The Attorney General, the government's chief legal officer, also had reservations. And so, unusually, the judge rejected the agreed plea and ordered a full jury trial. This was a significant moment. In the English legal system, for those watching from other countries, a judge can refuse to accept a plea arrangement if they believe the interests of justice require a full trial. It's uncommon, but it does happen. And it happened here. The trial began on May 5, 1981, at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London, the most famous courtroom in Britain, rather than in Yorkshire, because of the impossibility of finding an unbiased local jury. Over the course of the trial, the prosecution challenged Sutcliffe's claim of mental illness. They argued that his actions showed too much planning, too much forensic awareness, and too much self-preservation to be the product of a disorganized psychotic mind. They pointed out that he had gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid detection, using different weapons, varying his methods, returning to Jean Jordan's body to retrieve the £5 note. A man in the grip of uncontrollable divine command, they argued, would not behave like someone methodically covering their tracks. The defense maintained that Sutcliffe was genuinely mentally ill. His lawyers argued that schizophrenia does not preclude the ability to function, that many people with severe mental illness can appear outwardly normal while experiencing a profoundly disordered inner reality. Here's the reframing insight that changes how you might see this case. Both things could have been true. Sutcliffe could have experienced genuine psychotic symptoms and been capable of calculated behavior. Mental illness and criminal intent are not mutually exclusive. Modern psychiatric understanding recognizes that people with schizophrenia can and do plan their actions, even when those actions are driven by delusional beliefs. The trial framework of the early 1980s, guilty or diminished responsibility, prison or hospital, forced a binary choice onto a situation that was, in reality, far more complex. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. They rejected the diminished responsibility plea and found Peter Sutcliffe guilty on all 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. But the psychological dimensions of this case extend far beyond Sutcliffe's mind. Consider the investigators. George Oldfield, the man who had led the hunt and championed the Wearside tape, was devastated by the outcome. He had suffered a heart attack during the investigation, a physical manifestation of the pressure he was under. He never fully recovered his reputation and died in 1985 at the age of 61. His colleagues described a man who had been broken by the case, consumed by it, defined by it, and ultimately undone by it. Was Oldfield a bad detective? Not necessarily. He was a product of a system that was ill-equipped for a serial murder investigation of this scale. There was no national database, no interforce coordination protocol, no standardized method for managing large volumes of evidence. Oldfield applied the methods he knew. They weren't enough. Consider the media. Fleet Street, Britain's national newspaper industry, covered the Yorkshire Ripper case obsessively. And in doing so, it both reflected and reinforced the most troubling attitudes of the time. The language used to describe victims was starkly divided. Women involved in sex work were described in one register, prostitute, often without a surname, without a history. Women not involved in sex work were described in another, innocent, respectable, a girl any family would be proud of. This framing did something insidious. It suggested, implicitly, that the violence was more tolerable when directed at certain women. that it only became truly outrageous when it crossed a social boundary. And this framing was not merely distasteful, it was operationally damaging. Because it reinforced the police focus on red light districts and sex work connections and made it harder to see the broader pattern: a man who was attacking women. Any women. Alone. At night. Consider the communities. In Leeds, Bradford, Halifax, and Huddersfield, fear became a constant companion. Women's groups organized nighttime patrols. There were Reclaim the Night marches. University students were given safety escorts. And there was anger, not just at the killer, but at the police, who seemed unable to stop him. In some communities, that anger also turned inward. Men were looked at with suspicion by their neighbors. Relationships strained under the weight of paranoia. The social fabric of entire cities was damaged. And all of this, the psychological complexity of the perpetrator, the failures of the investigation, the biases of the media, the fear of the public, came to a head in a courtroom in London. But even the verdict wouldn't end the controversy. Resolution and aftermath. On May 22, 1981, Peter Sutcliffe was sentenced at the Old Bailey. Justice Borum handed down 20 concurrent life sentences, one for each count of murder and attempted murder, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 30 years before being considered for parole. In the courtroom, Sutcliffe stood motionless. He showed no visible emotion. In the public gallery, families of the victims watched in silence. Some wept. Some simply stared. For them, the verdict was a conclusion, but not a resolution. A guilty verdict does not erase grief. It does not restore a daughter, a mother, a sister. It closes the legal process. It does not close a wound. Sutcliffe was initially sent to HM Prison Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight, one of Britain's highest security facilities. But in 1984, after continued psychiatric assessment, he was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Berkshire. He had been formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and it was determined that he required treatment in a hospital setting rather than a conventional prison. This transfer angered many people. Families of the victims saw it as an injustice. A man who had murdered 13 women being housed in a hospital rather than a prison cell. Campaigners argued that Sutcliffe had manipulated psychiatrists to secure more comfortable conditions. In 2010, a High Court judge imposed a whole life order on Sutcliffe, meaning he would never be released. This was the most severe sentence available in the English legal system, reserved for the most serious offenders. In 2016, Sutcliffe was deemed mentally stable enough to return to a conventional prison. He was transferred to HMP Frankland, a high-security facility in County Durham, in the northeast of England. He died there on November 13, 2020, at the age of 74, from complications related to COVID-19. He had refused treatment. He was not mourned publicly. His death was reported widely but without ceremony. But the legacy of the case extends far beyond one man's life and death. The Byford Report. In 1981, immediately after Sutcliffe's conviction, the British Home Secretary commissioned a confidential review of the investigation. It was conducted by Lawrence Byford, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, essentially, the government's top auditor of police performance. The Byford Report was devastating. It identified catastrophic failures in cross-referencing evidence, in communication between police forces, and in the management of the investigation. It confirmed that Sutcliffe had been interviewed 9 times and that each interview had been conducted in isolation, without the interviewing officer knowing about the previous contacts. It documented how the Wearside Jack hoax had consumed disproportionate resources and created a false investigative framework that excluded the real killer. And it raised the uncomfortable question of whether the police had treated the case with less urgency because many of the victims were involved in sex work. The report was classified. For 25 years, it remained secret, seen only by senior police officials and government ministers. It was finally released to the public in 2006 under the Freedom of Information Act after persistent pressure from journalists and the victims' families. Its findings led directly to one of the most significant changes in British policing history. HOLMES, the Home Office Large Major Inquiry System. In the aftermath of the Byford Report, the British government commissioned the development of a standardized computer database for managing complex criminal investigations. The system, called HOLMES, was introduced in 1985 and has been used in every major investigation in England and Wales since. It was designed to prevent exactly the kind of failures that plagued the Yorkshire Ripper investigation: cross-referencing, automated flagging of recurring suspects, digital indexing of statements and evidence. The system that could have caught Sutcliffe years earlier was built because of the failure to catch him. On screen, timeline showing key dates from the first murder in 1975 to the Byford Report's public release in 2006. The victims' families. For the families of the 13 women who were killed, justice, such as it was, came mixed with bitterness. Richard McCann, the eldest son of Wilma McCann, was 7 years old when his mother was murdered. He and his siblings spent their childhoods in care homes. He later wrote a memoir, Just a Boy, describing the devastation the crime left in his family's life, not just the loss of his mother, but the years of institutional neglect, stigma, and silence that followed. Other families campaigned for decades for recognition, for apologies, and for the Byford Report to be made public. They fought against a media narrative that had divided their loved ones into innocent victims and those others. They insisted, correctly, that every victim deserved equal recognition, equal investigation, and equal compassion. In later years, there was a broader cultural reckoning with the language used to describe victims of violent crime. The term prostitute was increasingly challenged by advocates and journalists, who argued that it reduced human beings to a single dimension of their lives. The phrase women involved in sex work, or simply their names, became more common. This shift was not immediate, and it is still incomplete. But the Yorkshire Ripper case was a turning point in how Britain discussed violence against marginalized women. The Wearside Jack aftermath. John Humble, the man who sent the hoax tape, was identified in 2005 through DNA evidence taken from saliva on the envelopes of his letters. He was 50 years old, unemployed, and an alcoholic. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of perverting the course of justice and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge told Humble, "You are a sheer evil, cowardly man, a distraction to a massive police investigation." Some have argued that Humble's hoax directly contributed to the deaths of the 3 women killed after the tape was received: Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, and Marguerite Walls, and possibly Jacqueline Hill as well. Whether this constitutes a causal link in a strict legal sense is debatable. But in moral terms, the weight is undeniable. Humble was released in 2009 and died in 2019. What the case changed. Beyond Holmes, the Yorkshire Ripper case reshaped several aspects of British policing and criminal justice. It led to improved interforce communication, the recognition that serial offenders do not respect jurisdictional boundaries, and that police forces must share intelligence systematically. It prompted reforms in how police interact with vulnerable witnesses, particularly women involved in sex work, whose testimony had previously been undervalued. It contributed to the development of criminal profiling in the UK, the recognition that behavioral patterns and psychological analysis could be valuable investigative tools, not just academic exercises. And it sparked a national conversation about violence against women that, while slow and uneven, has continued for decades. A final reflection. There is a temptation in telling a story like this to make it about the killer, to treat Peter Sutcliffe as the center of the narrative, to explore his psychology, his motivations, his peculiar ordinariness. But that temptation should be resisted. The center of this story is not one man. It is 13 women whose lives were taken. It is 7 women who survived attacks that could have killed them. It is the families who endured decades of grief compounded by institutional failure. It is the communities that lived in fear for 5 years because the systems designed to protect them were not equal to the task. And it is a question that the case asks, not just of the police, not just of the media, not just of the legal system, but of all of us. Whose safety do we prioritize? Whose suffering do we take seriously? And what does it say about a society when the answer depends on who the victim is? Wilma McCann. Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane McDonald, Jean Jordan, Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritka, Vera Millward, Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, Jacqueline Hill. 13 names. 13 lives. The Yorkshire Ripper case didn't just expose a killer. It exposed the machinery that allowed him to continue, and it forced a country to ask whether that machinery had failed not by accident, but by design. The answers, even now, are not comfortable. And perhaps that's exactly why they still matter. If this case moved you or made you think differently about how investigations work, leave a comment below. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Enter the Crime. We'll be back soon with another story that deserves to be told properly.